I titled my presentation "The Principle of the Flank and the Emergence of a New World Order from the Corpse of the British Empire." I hope to be able to convey that in a short time and have time for questions. I think we have to start with a recognition that Obama has been thoroughly defeated by one of the most brilliant strategic thinkers of our time, which is Vladimir Putin. And the way he defeated him was through a sophisticated flank against Obama's weakness in the form of his functioning as an asset of the British Empire. The British Empire referring to the financial institutions of London and Wall Street, which have always been the core of the British Empire's imperial policies as well as their economic policies. If you look at what happened in Europe, we have, of course, the collapse of the European banking system, which is now, they can no longer keep off the front pages of the newspapers because of the total breakdown of their stock values, the recognition that they're all completely flooded with worthless speculative debts, which can no longer be bailed out, they can no longer be bailed in, they can no longer pump money in. It's reached a denouement, and it's about to blow apart. But in that context, the Obama administration launched this coup against Ukraine several years ago, openly supporting neo-Nazi organizations, carrying the swastika, openly working hand in hand, or actually praising the work of Stefan Bandera, who was Hitler's cohort in Ukraine in World War II. And this U.S.-sponsored by the Obama administration through his State Department asset, Victoria Nuland, who put in power Yatsenyuk, Poroshenko, and others in a coup led by literally armed, violent neo-Nazis. So Putin did not give in to this. He continued supporting those within Ukraine who resisted this Nazi coup, but never invaded. All of the accusations about Ukrainian invasion and so forth were subsequently shown to be nonsense. They were supporting them, those who were resisting, but they did not back down. But there was no solution to this in Europe. Obama and his British controllers succeeded in getting most of Europe at that time to go along with sanctions against Russia, supposedly as the aggressor, of which they, of course, were not aggressing against anybody. The Western forces, NATO, led by the U.S., began moving the most massive military forces up to the Russian border in history, more than any time, including the Hitler mobilization along Russia's borders before they launched the invasion of World War II. And this is what's going on today. But what Putin did was hit Obama on his weak flank, which was that Obama, like Bush before him, has been in an open alliance with the international terrorist organizations that we supposedly were fighting in the so-called war on terror. But like Bush, Obama served his masters in London and Wall Street in carrying out regime change against those governments who were refusing to accept the continued British imperial policies, those such as Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, and now Assad in Syria. Governments that had used their oil money wisely to develop their country, to restrain the terrorist impulses among some of the Saudi-funded Sunni networks, and repulse them not only militarily, but by developing the country in a way which was unprecedented in the rest of the Arab world. So the reality of Obama's collaboration with the British Saudi-funded terrorist networks around Al-Qaeda, which was most evident in Libya, where we launched an invasion outside of international law, outside of even our own constitutional law, by not even attempting to get our congressional support, which is required by our Constitution. But then moved on to Syria, where Putin recognized that this could no longer be hidden, that Obama was actually siding with the terrorists that we supposedly were opposing in order to overthrow Assad, as he did in Libya against Gaddafi, leaving Libya as a hellhole of warring terrorist factions, which was the intent. And the same result would come about in Syria if this were continued. And for those of you who haven't already heard this, I think it's extremely important to know that leading figures within the U.S. military and military intelligence have quite publicly identified the fact that Obama is, in a crazy fashion, allying himself with terrorists in order to achieve the regime change goal. General Michael Flynn, who was head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the intelligence agency for our military, in the 2012 to 14, I believe it was, until he was fired by Obama, publicly identified the fact that when Obama tried to invade Syria in 2013 over the chemical weapons, I'm sure you remember that he personally warned General Dempsey, the head of our Joint Chiefs, who then warned the president that this invasion would effectively be an invasion on the side of al-Qaeda, and the result would be the setup of a caliphate across both Syria and Iraq by the most radical, bloody, bestial forces amongst the Saudi-funded terrorist apparatus. And he was forced to turn back at that time, but as we know, he continued in a covert way through Turkey and through the Saudi apparatus to pursue this criminal, illegal war against the legitimate Assad government in Syria. So what did Putin do? Putin took a flank against Obama, not head-on in Ukraine, but he went into Syria to do what Obama claimed he was doing, which was to fight terrorism. He moved in with his Air Force, he reconstituted the legitimate government of Syria, the elected government of the Assad regime, the legitimate government. In other words, what they were doing by going in was legitimate under international law because he'd been invited by the legitimate government, unlike the U.S. bombing, which is totally illegitimate, against the desire of the Syrian government, let alone, as I said before, without having gone for approval from even our own Congress. So he's now about to win. This is a situation which the Obama criminal war, his effort now to use surrogates like the Saudis and the Turks, bluffing that they're going to intervene because they're terrified, frantic, that the Russians and the reconstituted Syrian army is about to defeat terrorism in Syria, which will obviously have tremendous implications for actually cleaning out the terrorist nests in the rest of the Middle East. And they have to stop it. That their ability to deal with the current global breakdown of the Western financial, not global, the Western financial system breakdown depends upon their capacity to do two things. One, to be able to continue dictating policy to all the nations of the world so that the ability to obtain cheap raw materials wherever they wish, as they have under the colonial and post-colonial era. And secondly, when necessary, to threaten war or potentially go to war against any country which would threaten the power of the U.S. to enforce that policy. This was a policy developed in the 1990s by people like Paul Wolfowitz and his friends. It became known as the Wolfowitz policy. The guy who gave us the Iraq War, the criminal Iraq War, that Wolfowitz had a doctrine which said that our responsibility as the only superpower was to make sure that no country or any group of countries would be allowed to even obtain the strength to be able to challenge our global hegemony militarily in order to impose our hegemony economically. So this has been blown to pieces. Obama has been defeated already in Syria. He's frantic, but there's not much they can do. Not only has he failed in the strategic realm, but the entire policy since the crash of 2007 and 8 to, as what Obama called his policy to restrain Wall Street, in fact was not a policy to restrain Wall Street, but to make sure they were not restrained. The so-called Dodd-Frank bill in the US, which was a bill which made sure that there would be no restraints on the wild speculative binge that had been unleashed in the United States when the Glass-Steagall bill was taken down in the 1990s. The Glass-Steagall bill, for those of you who may not know briefly, was Roosevelt's bedrock policy of forcing a division between investment banks who were allowed to speculate but had no government support under Glass-Steagall, and commercial banks who were not allowed to speculate had to use deposits to invest in the real economy for the general welfare of the population, in industry, agriculture, infrastructure, schools, hospitals, and so forth. And if they got in trouble because of problems with legitimate loans to legitimate productive capacity, then the government would step in and back them up with what is called the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, protecting people's deposits in these commercial banks. So that policy provided the basis for economic development in the US and Europe and Canada over the next 50 years, or whatever development there was. It began to be taken down in the 1980s by Alan Greenspan of JP Morgan, or JP Morgan, or Morgan Stanley, forgetting right now, but who then became head of the Federal Reserve and basically ran the takedown of Glass-Steagall and unleashed the wild speculative binge under the Bush administration at the turn of the century after Clinton left office. So the so-called Dodd-Frank bill, the various efforts to bail out the banks, has now proven to be a total failure. We've been 8 years now with massive bailouts, quadrillions of dollars. Basically what happened was that the debts, the worthless debts, the gambling debts of the banks, the countries were forced to take them over. We took them over. Our government here, the Fed, took over many of these debts through bailing them out, basically absorbing this worthless paper and putting it on government books, basically making the governments bankrupt, which is what we see now very clearly in Europe, where Greece and Spain, but really all of Europe, Germany even, have been forced to bail out their banks and are sitting on top of masses of worthless paper which cannot be bailed out any further because the governments themselves are bankrupt. So the bailout policy failed. They've now turned to bail in. Actually, it's written into the Dodd-Frank bill, bail in. If there's going to be a collapse, they say, we don't need the governments to bail them out anymore. We'll steal the depositors' money, people's life savings that they put into the bonds and the deposits of the banks. And this has already failed. It was implemented in Italy, in Cyprus earlier, but just in the last few months in Italy, and resulted in, on the one hand, many people committing suicide publicly when their life savings were stolen, but also a general failure of the policy to save the banks because, in fact, you're creating an environment in which people are going to stop using the banks if they know their money's simply going to be stolen when the bubble bursts. So this has failed. The interest rates were kept at zero for the last 8 years in Europe and the United States and Japan, longer in Japan, which the idea was that by having such low rates, the banks would use this money to invest in industry and we'd get our jobs back and our industries would grow. But of course, this money was not used to invest in the economy because our governments had given up on investing in the real progress of nations, our space program, our nuclear technology, our research and development in science and technology, all taken down in favor of speculation, of wild green fantasies, of windmills and solar cells, and then the fracking boom, which was economically a disastrous policy of wasting huge amounts of money to get oil out of shale at the cost of $50 to $60 a barrel. And of course, now that we have a general global collapse and oil is priced at $30, the shale oil bubble in the banks is somewhat equivalent to the subprime mortgage bubble of the 2005, 6, 7 period. So all of this has failed. There's been an absolute failure of Obama's strategic and economic policies and those of his British sponsors and supporters. I would point to the fact that the bail-in policy I just described was officially implemented on January 1st all over Europe. And LaRouche, in his typical great foresight, forecast that starting January 1st you would see a general crumbling of the Western banking system. And in fact, it began exactly then. For a while, nobody understood why, but finally they're beginning to acknowledge that it's because of this. Even Ambrose Evans Pritchard and other gurus are beginning to acknowledge that LaRouche was right, that it was because this bail-in policy is going to cause panic in an already bankrupt situation. So, the Glass-Steagall restoration is the only hope. I'm sure you've all had discussions with our associates up in Canada about the Glass-Steagall, what it means. You'll have to excuse me for 1 second. Sorry. And this Glass-Steagall legislation, we have bills before the House and the Senate in the United States, and in Italy and in the European Parliament. There's efforts there in Canada to reinstall this Glass-Steagall bill. The only thing holding it back is the fear and cowardice of our Congress. We have many, many co-signers in these bills, but they aren't acting. And this is because of the fear, it's because of the brainwashing going on around this election facade here in the United States, where people are being told that we don't care what's going on right in front of our eyes, the fact that we're on the brink of thermonuclear war, the fact that we're facing a global financial disaster. All we're going to talk about is who's going to be president a year from now, when it probably won't matter if we even have a human race a year from now, with the threat of war and general economic collapse. So this is the war we have to carry out, we have to fight, we have to win. We have no choice here. We're looking at a general collapse of such severity that we have to act. Now luckily, we have on our side not only the brilliant strategic policies of Putin, but we have what our organization and Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche especially have been absolutely instrumental in implementing, which is the New Silk Road concept being led today by China, by Xi Jinping. Now what's happened in the last couple of weeks is that the growing recognition by Obama's controllers that they've lost the situation in Syria and to a certain extent throughout the Middle East and Europe. This was not a flanking operation in Syria. This was a flanking operation by Putin against the British Empire, against Obama and his British Empire controllers. And what he did was expose the criminality of that empire. He's not only saving Syria, he's exposing the empire's criminality on a global scale. Nonetheless, the policy taken by Obama and his controllers is to escalate rapidly and dramatically in Asia. Now this really brings to bear the issue of the role of the British Empire historically. I'm sure you've all seen the headlines in the last few weeks after the North Koreans launched or tested a nuclear weapon. They've had 4 now tests, and then successfully launched a satellite. The Western powers and media went berserk that this is a great danger, that this is a threat to civilization from a crazy regime, and therefore we have to massively build up our forces in Asia, in South Korea, and in the region about there. And in fact, we immediately broke the resistance within South Korea to the Obama effort to deploy so-called THAAD missiles, high-altitude missiles, into South Korea. And unfortunately, it looks like the South Korean government has capitulated to this. Before that, President Park Geun-hye had a Eurasian vision. She saw that only by working closely with Russia and China were they ever going to actually resolve the issue in North Korea through development, through railroads, through gas pipelines, through various things that are already in place. But this test and this missile launch convinced, unfortunately, a very weak president, it turns out, in South Korea to capitulate. So we're now seeing these THAAD missiles sent in there. It's important to note that these high-altitude missiles have absolutely no effect against North Korea, which is 30 miles away. They aren't going to be sending ICBMs to South Korea. These are only aimed at China and Russia, the Russian Far East. And the Chinese know it. And the Chinese are making it very public that this is a direct military threat against China, just as the deployment of our NATO forces up along the border in Russia, in Europe, and the anti-ballistic missile systems in Poland and Romania is a threat of war not seen since the Nazi mobilization to invade Russia. And this is exactly what the Chinese are saying today. Not only did we send 4 Raptor jets, the most advanced fighter jet in the world, into South Korea, not only are we expanding our exercises there. In fact, there's going to be a Marine exercise literally exercising the invasion of North Korea to send in troops to take out their nuclear and space capacity. And let me just mention that no one wants to see North Korea develop nuclear weapons. Even the Chinese are very strongly saying, don't. It's not going to help you. It's going to only allow provocative responses from the U.S. But keep in mind what North Korea sees. They're not crazy. First of all, they're strange, but they're not crazy. They're not going to use a nuclear weapon against anybody. They know they'd be blown off the face of the earth if they were ever to do so. It's simply, in their view, they see what happened to Libya. They see what happened to Iraq. Nations that had nuclear weapons programs gave them up under pressure from the West, and once they'd given them up, were bombed back into the Stone Age. And a regime in Washington which is publicly, openly committed over and over again to regime change around the world and to having their way, as Obama likes to say, we write the rules. Therefore, the North Koreans have, I think, justification. There's a way to stop it, it should be stopped, but it's not by these kinds of threats and mobilizing military forces whose real purpose is for a war on China. And as far as their space shot goes, no nation should be denied the right to a space program. Having a missile that can put a satellite in space is far, far different from having an ICBM which can come back into the atmosphere and be targeted to hit something. It's all hype to justify a war on China that they don't want to call a war on China. But, on the other hand, if you go down south a little bit to the South China Sea, I'm sure you've all seen all the headlines on this too. The U.S. is accusing China of aggression in the South China Sea. Well, let's look what's happening in the South China Sea. The Chinese control many of the islands in the Spratlys and the Paracel Islands. Other countries control other islands, Philippines, Malaysia, Taiwan, Vietnam, and others. And they have for many, many years. What the Chinese have started to do is to build some islands on the shoals that they control. This is called aggression. This is called militarizing the South China Sea. And then a couple of days ago, you'll see, I'm sure you saw in the headlines, SAM missiles, surface-to-air missiles discovered on a Chinese island in the Paracel Islands. The island of Woody Island, they call it, where the city of Sansha is, which is the city, by the way, this is a built-up island. There's 2,000 people that have been living there for 50 years, Chinese people. It's a well-developed 5-mile square island, which is the capital of the other islands in the Chinese possession. And they've discovered surface-to-air missiles there. Well, these defensive measures have been in these islands for 50 years. They've never been hidden. They're always there. All of a sudden, we've discovered that they have what's been there for 50 years. Very minimal defensive technology. But that's militarizing the South China Sea, and it's very dangerous. And therefore, we have to rapidly go forward with our plan in the Philippines to set up half a dozen to a dozen new U.S. military bases, although it's completely forbidden by the Philippine Constitution. But the puppet government there, under President Aquino, who follows every hint from Obama, has agreed to basically put aside the Constitution and allow the U.S. to set up the most advanced air, sea, and land forces in bases across the Philippines, including 2 on Palawan Island. If you look at a map of the Philippines, you'll see that there's the archipelago, and then you have an island called Palawan that juts right up into the South China Sea. The U.S. is deploying 2 air and naval bases on Palawan Island, right in the middle of the South China Sea, with, again, the most advanced air, sea, land power in the world, in history. But China is militarizing the South China Sea. You'll see in the headlines on the Washington Post and New York Times and LA Times and so forth. This is the British imperial policy of Bertrand Russell, that we can convince the population that snow is black if we say it loud enough. It was known as the Goebbels policy in Nazi Germany, but really it's the Bertrand Russell policy, the brainwashing policy. Is you basically drug up a nation, as you have here in the United States, where we're experiencing the worst drug epidemic in the history of the nation, the worst heroin epidemic in the history of the nation, with a president who's legalizing drugs and collaborating with the drug terror networks in Colombia and elsewhere to expand the massive destruction of the human population in our country. And I'm sure this is just the same in Canada. I don't know the details. So what is it that China's really doing in the South China Sea? They're developing what they can for the benefit of all nations. And this is not just something happening in the South China Sea. This is happening throughout the world. This is the land bridge policy, the new Silk Road policy. I'm sure you have on hand there the 370-page report that we wrote a year and a half ago called The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge. This is the proposal that especially Mrs. LaRouche, Helga LaRouche, who is known in China as the Silk Road Lady, who organized as far back as 1996 a conference in Beijing with the Chinese government on what they called then the land bridge, the European land bridge, Eurasian land bridge, but which we called the New Silk Road at that time, and which the new president of China, Xi Jinping, has in fact adopted the term the New Silk Road, or the Silk Road economic belt through Central Asia, and the new maritime Silk Road through Southeast Asia and through the waters going into the Indian Ocean. They call it the one belt, one road policy. So this is a development policy for the world. We extended it from Eurasia into Europe to the whole world. Our report includes how this has to be the basis for dealing with South America and Africa, nations that have been destroyed by the colonial and post-colonial era. And in particular, Helga Zepp-LaRouche emphasized development of the Middle East. That the only way to end the intentional British division of the Islamic world into Sunni Shia conflicts, ethnic conflicts, national conflicts, is to take the Silk Road development concept, the peace through development idea, into the Middle East. And I hope you all follow that Xi Jinping just finished a tour of Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Egypt, where he did precisely what Helga had proposed, using many of the programs that in fact are in that report, which, by the way, the Chinese have translated into Chinese and immediately mass distributed to all the think tanks, universities, and governmental offices. 1,000 copies were distributed by the Chinese after translating that report. So this is not just a report on what China is doing. This is essentially our having authored the policy that's increasingly being developed and used by the Chinese government. This is ours. This is what LaRouche has done historically over these last, especially over the last 20 years, but for 45, 50 years, really. So China's doing this, not only in Central Asia, not only in Southeast Asia, but throughout Africa and South America. You look at some of the maps in that report, you'll see that as in Africa, for instance, the only railroads that existed under the colonial and post-colonial era in Africa were those built from the ports to the mines. All they cared about was getting their raw materials out. The nations themselves were never developed. You couldn't even get from one capital to the other by rail. You could not get across the continent by rail, or even by road in many cases. The Chinese are building high-speed rail connections through every city in Africa. They need raw materials just like the Western countries did, but they're paying for them by building nations This is a new paradigm for the world. And as I'm sure you know, they're also creating the new financial institutions to make that possible. Through the BRICS alliance, they set up a new development bank, doing what the World Bank claimed it was going to do, but long ago gave up on doing, which is building infrastructure. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, set up by the Chinese themselves, doing similar things, putting tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars into real development throughout the world. It's not just money, it's development. It's the physical economy. This is what they're doing. What are they doing in the US and Canada? Well, virtually nothing. They're being stopped, actually, every time they even try to take over a company or something, because somehow they're the enemy. So, counter this to the British Empire. Look at the British Empire's history in Asia. When the British East Indies Company took over India and, in a sense, took over China, never completely, but they basically ruled it, and of course other parts, and the Dutch and the Portuguese and the French, dividing France up, dividing Asia up between their imperial powers. What did they do? Well, they, of course, looted their raw materials, but it was a lot worse than that. The British grew heroin, or opium, in India. And then they shipped it into China, where there wasn't any. And when the Chinese resisted, they waged war because they were disrupting free trade. This is the British idea of free trade. Freedom to the British system means the freedom of trade. We can trade in bodies, in the slave system. That was free trade. And we can deal with opium. And when the Chinese government tried to interfere with free trade, i.e. the drugging up of their population, the British went to war twice, 2 opium wars, laid waste to entire cities, brought in their gunboats, destroyed the cities, destroyed much of what was one of the great cultures in the world, but which had been undermined by also Western operations to sabotage collaboration between the East and the West. That's another long story. But having basically laid waste to China, the British said, we have liberated them. We've brought civilization to China through the freedom of banks to loot, of people to peddle their drugs, and so forth. So, what happened to the United States? Well, we had Franklin Roosevelt, who fought the British system. He recognized that the emergence of fascism in Europe had been brought about by the City of London, by the banking system in London, who financed Hitler's rise to power and Mussolini's rise to power, and the Spanish fascists as well. So Roosevelt saw that he had to defeat this Nazi scourge that had been created by the British, but he made it clear to Winston Churchill and everyone else that he did not fight World War II to save the British Empire, but that in fact he was going to use American system methods to take the colonies that had been kept in a state of absolute backwardness throughout the imperial era and bring them into the modern world. What China is now doing today is what Roosevelt intended to do. And Roosevelt unfortunately died before the war was out, and immediately the British moved in through their puppet Truman and others. And by and large, every president we've had since that time, with exceptions, Eisenhower, somewhat of an exception, Kennedy, definitely an exception, who tried to restore the FDR policies, but was therefore killed by the British. And others who have just increasingly allowed the U.S. to be run by Wall Street as a free trade operation, giving up the American system idea, which was a central government whose purpose was to invest in the real economy, to uplift the general welfare of the population as a whole, to foster the pursuit of happiness, a term that came from Leibniz, who was the greatest inspiration to the American founding fathers, the German philosopher and scientist. But that was sabotaged. Instead, we were told, no, freedom is not the freedom to develop the creative powers of your mind. That's not where happiness comes from. Happiness comes from getting high, from getting laid, and basically being destroyed by listening to bestial, backward noise called popular music. This is the rock, drug, sex counterculture. I have to excuse myself again, just a moment. I'm home today with a sick dog, I'm afraid. I won't go through the details. So this is what America and the West and Europe, Canada, swallow. Not always openly, but by and large swallowed. That freedom is the freedom to be an anarchist, practically an animal. The rock, drug, sex counterculture. That we don't need science. Science pollutes. Science causes global warming. Such nonsense as this. That the problem in the world is that there's too many people. That we need to depopulate. People are polluting the earth. We have to love Mother Earth. This is Prince Philip. This is the bestial colonial policy of keeping the world in a state of intentional backwardness and reducing the world population in order to sustain oligarchical power and control. So we're given freedom, which is freedom of the flesh, not freedom of the mind. This is what we have to reject, absolutely. The Chinese are experiencing a truly great renaissance. It's not going to succeed as a Chinese renaissance. The Chinese had a great renaissance in the 12th century under the Sung dynasty. Confucian renaissance. They like our renaissance in the 14th century and 15th century. They restored, like we restored the Platonic tradition from Greece. They restored the Confucian and Mencius tradition from the same era as Plato. And in doing so, unleashed a tremendous scientific binge in Europe, in China, which, when the Jesuit missionaries arrived there later, and the same Leibniz who gave inspiration to the American Constitution was working hand in hand, corresponding with the Jesuits in China, who were reading the Confucian doctrine, and especially that of Jushi in the Sung dynasty, the great Confucian leader in that era, and who recognized that China had a more advanced culture than Europe, even in the 1600s, 1700s, that they had bigger cities, they had a more educated population, a broader layer of the population with advanced education, that their government was driven by the quality of thinking rather than popularity in the banal sense, and that they had a very profound philosophic tradition which Leibniz recognized was coherent with his own thinking, but with the thinking of the great Christian theologians. So this was a Chinese Renaissance that he was studying, comparing it. And I did work while I was in prison here in the United States under George Bush. I did a great deal of study of the comparison between the European Christian Renaissance and the Confucian Renaissance in China. What China's doing today is not just repeating the Confucian Renaissance. They're launching a Renaissance which will only succeed as a global Renaissance. When Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche call on the United States and Canada and Europe to accept Xi Jinping's proposal that we join with them in the Silk Road, we join with them in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, they're not excluding us. We are excluding them, as I've discussed, economically as well as strategically, the TPP, for instance. But they are saying we can have an inclusive world based on development. Join us. And of course, this is what we're fighting for here, is to break through, to give people a sense that this is not only possible, but absolutely necessary. We have to have a new Renaissance, and it has to be global in scope. We have to even go beyond the question of sovereign nations. We must defend sovereignty, but we have to have a cooperation among sovereign nations, which makes it possible for us to have a world in which people think about how we can advance ourselves and others as our actual self-interest. This is the last chance we have. The world is sitting on the brink of thermonuclear war. It could literally break out at any time. If, for instance, the effort of the Turks to invade Syria, which wiser minds within the U.S., like Kerry, have stopped, despite Obama's being the closest friend of this would-be new Ottoman Emperor, Erdogan, in Turkey, who has, along with the Saudis, been threatening to invade Syria or to set up a no-fly zone in Syria, which would put them in direct NATO country, Turkey, in direct conflict with Russia, who is there doing what we claim to be doing, which is wiping out terrorists. Then we would be literally sitting on the brink of World War III. Within days, this is what's being discussed right now. Similar situation in Asia. I won't go through the details, but the Chinese are very, very aware that this can be provoked literally on a minute's notice, and that we could be at war. They're putting out government reports from military people saying, if you try to launch an invasion of North Korea, we know what that is, and you're going to have to deal with China. These are thermonuclear wars that are being discussed. So we only have these two paths. Let me mention, if you haven't, you probably haven't discussed it, just this weekend, some of our people in New York, as part of Mr. LaRouche's Manhattan Project, went to a meeting of a group which is probably the best we have in America from the academic and diplomatic schools. It's a group called the Committee for East-West Accord. It includes people like Dr. Stephen Cohen, who has been a strong defender of the Russians and Putin, former ambassadors like Van der Heuvel and Matlock, who were ambassadors to Russia, and others who have been part of an effort who have been screaming at the top of their lungs that we're heading for nuclear war, that this isolation and demonization of Russia is leading us to the brink of war, that the driving of our military forces up to their border is threatening a war which could blow up the world. And, you know, we have to admire that they're doing that. But there have been a series now of 3 interventions by LaRouche representatives in the Manhattan Project. The first one, they, after hearing their very serious concern about war, Elliot Greenspan and Suzanne Clevey and others basically said, well, look, you have to recognize that Obama is the person who is pushing for this war, for regime change and for economic destitution, which is driving the world to war. Why don't you join with us in impeaching Obama? And they all said, no, we're going to try to convince Obama. Good luck. So this kind of foolishness LaRouche denounced. It showed it was their cowardice. He didn't say, gee, good work, I'm glad you're against war, thanks a lot. No, he said, look, you're fools if you think that you can do this without getting Obama out of office now, not in the election, now. We're facing war now, and global depression now. So they met again a couple months, about a month or 2 later, and at that event, similar exchange, talked about the new Silk Road, why don't you join with us in development, why don't you impeach Obama? And this time, some of them said, well, we must admit that Obama can no longer be considered a tool of the war hawks. He is the president, the buck stops there, he's the one pushing this war policy. So they made a slight adjustment and said, yeah, we have to admit Obama's to blame. Impeach? Oh, no, we're not talking impeachment. Now, this Saturday or Friday, Friday, they met again in New York, and both Elliot and Suzanne Clevey went there. And this was quite interesting. They're scared to death. And when Elliot and Suzanne got up and said, why don't you join this Silk Road? You're talking about a new détente, Suzanne said. Well, we don't need détente with Russia. The fact of the matter is Putin's in charge. We don't have to find out how to reconcile with Putin. We have to recognize that he and Xi Jinping in China have created a new world paradigm, which we have to join. We have to learn from them and join it. Don't talk about détente. That's a thing of the past. We have to have this new world paradigm. It's there for us to join. Of course, it means removing Obama. It means implementing Glass-Steagall to shut down Wall Street. Why don't you do that with us? And this time, both Professor Cohen and Professor Van der Heuvel, or Ambassador Van der Heuvel, both of them said, look, We know what you're talking about. We basically agree. We understand. We've read your material. In fact, Ambassador van der Heuvel attended this wonderful concert in Manhattan of the Messiah that we did, which I'm sure you've all heard about. We understand that. And let me say that I basically agree with you. And yeah, we'll meet again. But there's just, I don't know. I'm not sure we can do what you say. They're terrified. They're absolutely terrified. They know that Mr. LaRouche tells the truth. He doesn't say, well, here's a partial measure. He knows how to win. We know how historically Roosevelt won in his era, and LaRouche knows how to win now. The problem is that people are terrified. They're terrified of the power of Wall Street. They're terrified of the murderer Obama. They saw what happened when John Kennedy and his brother were killed when they took on Wall Street and the power of the British Empire. And they're scared. And that fear has to be overcome by us, each of us, who has to have the courage to tell the truth to power and to make clear that there is a solution which can and must be implemented now in these coming days and weeks at most, because that's all the time we have. It means that each of us has to be committed to personally working to bring about a global renaissance, not to do our little bit, but to join in what has to become a global movement, to learn from Russia and China in doing that, but to restore the American system, the North American power it once was, power for good, and to do that can only be done if it's done in conjunction with Russia and China, with the BRICS, and it's done now before we end up watching lunatics of the Obama sort pushing the button, or the financial breakdown, which is now days away, weeks away at most, bringing such cataclysmic collapse and destitution and death that it becomes impossible to act. So it's a desperate situation, but it's also a very hopeful one. I'll just conclude by saying that when I met LaRouche in 1972, the thing I remember most from that speech I went to was that he said, people aren't going to like what we say. You might meet a person here, a person there, and they're the people that we'll pull together and we'll work with them and educate them and get them to be the fighters. But what I'm saying is true. We're going to be on the brink of war and global financial disaster as a result of the failed policies being implemented right now. This is under Nixon in '72. This is how far back this goes. But he said, at the point at which what we say is recognized, then we better be in a position to lead. We better have the courage to be world leaders, each of us, ourselves. And that is the situation we have today. It's a tremendous opportunity in the midst of great danger, but it's one which we can thank the powers that be on high, that we've had Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche and the movement, the brilliance of their insight, pulling together great scientists and great leaders from around the world over these last 50 years, that we have the power and the capacity to do this, if people will have the courage to join us and not be afraid, but to take on a solution rather than fearfully hide from this reality. So I'll end with that.
Hi, Mike. Pascal.
Hi.
I had a question because, yeah, we're hearing a lot of, well, as you mentioned, the propaganda coming out here in our media is very bad, you know, in trying to address what is China, what is Russia, how we can't work with them. Like, that's always what they say. They say, we're trying, they're really, but we can't work with them because we're authoritarian dictatorships and stuff. And I wanted to ask you about, because in the history of Russia and China, they have a very different idea. And what we call imperialism here in the West, they haven't experienced the same way. So I wanted to get your idea on this, if you could.
Well, I've given some presentations before on what is to many people amazing fact that the American system, as it was developed by Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and developed by our few really great presidents, John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, and then of course Franklin Roosevelt, and JFK, that this American system has died in the United States. I discussed this a bit, that we were taken over by the British free trade ideology, by libertarianism, by the idea that freedom is freedom of the flesh, not freedom of the mind, and so forth. But ironically, the history of America, its greatest thinkers, permeated the world during the first century especially, or continuing. Every great period of America, the ideas of the American system permeated the world. And they permeated Europe, the great German coming together as a nation under Bismarck, which made Germany into the great industrial nation and scientific nation that it is, came about because of the collaboration of Henry Carey, who was a collaborator of Lincoln, who was the person who formulated the idea of the Transcontinental Railroad, and in fact was working on building what's the term? A girding of the world with steel, meaning rail connections. They even talked about building the tunnel under the Bering Strait that Mr. LaRouche is champion now, and which Putin has supported. It's connecting the United States and Russia through a tunnel from Alaska into Siberia. So he went to Germany. He gave them the American system. He helped Bismarck create the Zollverein, the economic institutions that brought about their defeat of the British free trade policies. He went to Russia. The Siberian Railroad was built because of Henry Carey's work in Russia, recalling the work that John Quincy Adams had done with Russia. And by the way, that Leibniz, earlier, had collaborated with Peter the Great in working together with Russia and China on building the idea of linking Europe and Asia through a development corridor, reaching out through these great cultures of China and Europe together. So the Russians very much adopted the American system. And much of what was developed, including during some of the communist era, was based on the American system of development. In China, it's even more explicit. Not only do you have this historic connection that I referred to, the Leibniz connection is in a sense very real there. His work with the Jesuits who were working with the Chinese in the Qing dynasty. But you also have Sun Yat-sen. What Sun Yat-sen represents, he's the founder of the Chinese Republic, who led the Republican Revolution in 1911 that overthrew the monarchies, the imperial powers, and created a republic, which had its problems over the years. But Sun Yat-sen is still honored as the founder of modern China by communists and non-communists alike, in Taiwan as well as in Beijing. And Sun Yat-sen was trained in the American system. He was, as a young man, went to Hawaii with his brother. He was educated by Americans from the school, the Lincoln School, of Henry Carey, of the same group that had done the work in Germany and in Russia. He was very, very conscious of the distinction between Alexander Hamilton and the idea of industrial and development progress, as opposed to that of Thomas Jefferson, the slaveholders, the advocates of slavery, the agriculturalists who wanted to keep the country backward as an agriculture country with slave labor. He knew these distinctions, which most Americans today don't know. They think Hamilton and Jefferson are co-founders of America, which is nonsense. There was a war that was never settled until the Civil War between the Hamilton Circle, centered in New York, committed to the idea of scientific and technological development and the upgrading of every human being, regardless of race and so forth, as the purpose of America, as opposed to these southern slaveholders who never relinquished their right to be bestial. and by treating other human beings as beasts. So Sun Yat-sen knew this. He brought to China the American system. He had a plan for developing the rail and water projects across China, which is what we see being developed today by Xi Jinping. It's the American system being implemented by China. The Silk Road is, to a very real extent, I mean, of course, tremendous contributions from China and from their rich culture. But it's their recognition that there's a commonality with the American system that brought this about. Just as it's a recognition in China today of the role of Helga and Lyndon LaRouche in building this Silk Road idea that you can bridge these gaps only through development. You can't stop these political crises by political negotiations. They're only going to be solved by posing a higher order of development as the basis on which you have a common aim of mankind. This was known as the American system. Now, anybody who swallows this stuff about Chinese and Russian dictatorship and aggression, these people have lost their ability to think. They simply don't think anymore. They swallow whatever opinions shoved down their throats by the media. Right? So, yeah, Putin might be against proselytizing homosexuality. Therefore, he's not a Democrat. Xi Jinping may be against speculators unleashing hell upon their financial system by people like George Soros. Therefore, he's opposed to freedom. Right? Well, this has to be countered by people thinking. We have to instill in our fellow men the ability to think and not be subjected to the kind of Bertrand Russell brainwashing which permeates our newspapers, our so-called entertainment, which is nothing but ugly violence, sex, and perversion, which is called entertainment, to turn off the radio with this disgusting so-called popular music and master even those people who went through life never getting any exposure to classical music because our schools don't teach it anymore. Start now. Master the great works. Because great classical music is not, it's not just a music of a period. It is a music of a period. It expresses the great Renaissance periods in which it was produced. But it's music that reaches into the human mind and calls upon that mind to use its God-given powers of reason. That's what great music does. As LaRouche always says, classical music appeals to above the belt. The other music that we hear all the time is the other side of the belt. And that's not what we need. We need human beings who can think. So it's not hard to prove that Russia and China are leading a new paradigm for development. It's there. It's in front of our eyes. It's clear that Russia is defeating terrorism, what we said we were doing, but in fact allied with terrorism in order to receive regime change, British colonial-style regime change. And that China is carrying out the kind of great development program that Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt were committed to and carried out to a great extent in their lifetimes. We have to join that. The only way to deal with people who are stupid is to say you're stupid. Think. Use your mind. Stop being a fool.
Hello, sir. I have a question from an Argentinian here in Canada. I'd like to know what's the current links between these ideas and the present situation in South America, where the right wing, the corporations are menacing this regional intelligent ways for becoming republics in depth and offering new alternatives to the world, to the thinking of a new humanity in its best. I know that there was this center, a branch of your movement in Argentina that was stopped. It was very good. I don't know what happened there because ideas were there and you were informing cleverly about your ideas. But what's the current situation? Because you know, Argentina was taken by this Cambiemos party, and they're destroying all what Cristina had done, and Dilma is menaced, and Venezuela is so much criticized. How are you planning to use the South American strength that is very much creative and in the line of what you say as one of the convenient ways to go? And China is close, was close to Cristina, Putin was close. What's the possibility of blocking this advance of the right wings there?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. The only solution is what we do here in North America. But let me just sort of review the history for those who don't know. The BRICS really were born, I mean, they existed already as a loose grouping, but it was really born in Fortaleza, I think that's the way you pronounce it, in Brazil, in the summer of 2014, where Putin and Xi Jinping was Modi in already? I'm forgetting who was representing India at that time. I think Modi was already in. Went to Fortaleza, and they formed, this was the annual meeting of the BRICS. But this, and because Brazil, of course, is a member of the BRICS. Brazil and South Africa are the B and the S in BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But Brazil and South Africa are not really simply representing themselves. They're the strongest economies of Africa and South America, but to a very real extent, they are simply representative of those entire continents. And this was demonstrated at Fortaleza when they had this meeting, but they had it simultaneously with the meeting of the, I'm forgetting the name of the Latin American Alliance of all the countries of South America and Central America, who met simultaneously with that meeting. And they all met with Putin and Xi Jinping. And it was a coming together of the entire continent around this idea of development. And if you look at the map of South America, the Chinese, as you referenced, are doing the same thing I mentioned before about Africa. They're building 2 cross-continental rail connections, hopefully with Bolivia involved. I mean, you have this amazing case of Bolivia, a country with, you know, basically, well, a very poor country, whose leader came in from the indigenous Indian population, and we were very afraid he was going to be a drug dealer and so forth. And this guy has taken responsibility for leading a fight for nuclear power and technology, not only in Bolivia but across South America. The Chinese are very much involved in this. But as we've seen, this subjected them to the most massive, intense attacks by the British Empire, to a great extent using their assets on Wall Street. It was primarily Wall Street and these vulture funds. The vulture funds are those who, when a country is in great trouble or a business is in great trouble and their stock collapses and their debt is in trouble, they go in and buy up bonds and debts at a nickel on the dollar and then insist on a 100% payoff. So when Argentina, under Cristina, or under her husband, Kirchner, when they had gone bankrupt and had to declare a moratorium on the debt, they negotiated a haircut for their creditors. They ended up paying about a third of the debt with the agreement, as is legal under all the international laws, so that their creditors would get something, not nothing, by a complete bankruptcy of the country. But a small portion, about 8% of the creditors, refused to accept the deal. And these are the vulture funds, who bought these things at about a nickel or less on the dollar and refused to take 33%, which would have given them a huge profit. But no, these are not just people out to make money. These are the thugs. These are the mafia hitmen of the British Empire. Their policy was to bring down the government, not to make the money. They might get the money, they might not. That's not what counts to them. What counts to them and their controllers on Wall Street in the City of London is to bring down Christina. to bring down Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, to prevent these nations who are lining up with sanity, with development, against the bestiality of the so-called Washington Consensus, the zero growth, deindustrialization, legalization of drugs, population control policies being shoved down their throats by the British Empire and their stoolies in Washington. So, saying that, there's much that is being done, by the Chinese mostly, to bring development to these countries, and it's only that development that can bring back those forces that are committed to development. But really, there's not going to be a solution until we solve it here, because the power, the Latin Americans just don't have the power to do it. We do. If we break those who are trying to re-enslave the people in South America, break them here, break Wall Street, shut down Wall Street, which does not need to exist. We need our commercial banks, but the only way to save those commercial banks is to shut down these banks that are so-called too big to fail banks, not just break them up. You know, when you hear Bernie Sanders and these frauds who are claiming to be fighting Wall Street, they talk about breaking up the banks, breaking up the banks. This is a fraud. You don't want to break them up. They have to be shut down. All of that debt is fake. It's not real. It's gambling debts. It's debts. I hope you've all seen the movie The Big Short. This is a brilliant movie done based on a book which is probably the best book about the 2007-8 collapse, about the creation of CDOs, these collateralized debt obligations, which was the basis on which the subprime mortgage bubble was built up through that and credit default swaps. This whole creation of these artificial entities, which could be gambled upon and then gambled upon the gambling, creating this massive pool of money, all of which was based on nothing. On, in that case, mortgages which they knew could not be paid. But they didn't care because they weren't making money in the mortgages. They were making money on the gambling casino, the pyramids built on top of them. Go see the movie. It's very well done. But the this crowd on Wall Street are the ones who are running the destruction of South America. That's what colonialism is. It was under the British Empire. The British East Indies Company, which ran the colonization of India and elsewhere, was a private company. It was the banks. It was the Barings Bank and what became the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, which even today is at the center of the international drug trafficking. And has admitted it. But instead of going to jail, they pay a little fine and go on with their drug laundering. So it has to be done here. It has to be reversed here. There's nothing I can recommend except fighting against this evil in those countries and working with the BRICS, with China, as much as you possibly can, but to join with us in the fight here to overturn this evil administration, or this system, this British Empire system that has now taken over the Europe and America nations.
We have time for one last brief question. Sorry, Mike. We have time for one last very brief question, and I think we have one here from Philoni and Devin.
Hey, Mike. I just wanted to ask if you could talk about the differences between.
Louder.
If you can talk about the differences between the NASA's somewhat space program and what China is doing with their lunar mission, the Chang'e missions and whatnot, and fusion, and how each respective government treats those institutions and how they work for society.
I could say something, but as I understand it, Bob is going to be giving a full presentation on that right now.
Yeah.
Right, Bob?
Yes, that's correct.
But let me leave that. He'll answer your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So somebody can go, Raphael, if you could go and fetch Bob, who should be in the hallway, that would be good. So we have, So we have coming up right now a brief presentation which will be given by Dr. Robert Hux, who's an organizer and a representative of the Committee for the Republic of Canada for over 20 years, who will be presenting on reviving the space program. The outlook of Kraft Erica, a leading space pioneer, will be introduced. And we're going to go into what China has been doing in reviving this lost dream which we once had, to become a species unbounded by any physical constraints, and unleashed as the first self-consciously created species ever to be created or ever to show up on the Earth. So with that, I'll leave the stage for Dr. Hux to come up and prepare his slideshow. Do you have a slide? Yeah.
Je l'ai déconnecté parce qu'à un moment donné c'était trop bon, j'entendais vraiment. Au début c'était correct, à un moment donné je comprenais ce qu'il disait, après j'entends plus la voix du.
Sponsored by the Obama administration through his State Department asset Victoria Nuland, who put in power Yatsenyuk, Poroshenko, and others in a coup led by literally armed, violent neo-Nazis. So Putin did not give in to this. He continued supporting those within Ukraine who resisted this Nazi coup, but never invaded. All of the accusations about Ukrainian invasion and so forth were subsequently shown to be nonsense. They were supporting them, those who were resisting, but they did not back down. But there was no solution to this in Europe. Obama and his British controllers succeeded in getting most of Europe at that time to go along with sanctions against Russia, supposedly as the aggressor, of which they, of course, were not aggressing against anybody. The Western forces, NATO, led by the US, began moving the most massive military forces up to the Russian border in history, more than any time, including the Hitler mobilization along Russia's borders before they launched the invasion of World War II. And this is what's going on today. But what Putin did was hit Obama on his weak flank, which was that Obama, like Bush before him, has been in an open alliance with the international terrorist organizations that we supposedly were fighting in the so-called war on terror. But like Bush, Obama served his masters in London and Wall Street in carrying out regime change against those governments who were refusing to accept the continued British imperial policies, those such as Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, and now Assad in Syria. Governments that had used their oil money wisely, paying policy to all the nations of the world so that the ability to obtain cheap raw materials wherever they wish, as they have under the colonial and post-colonial era. And secondly, when necessary, to threaten war or potentially go to war against any country which would threaten the power of the U.S. to enforce that policy. This was a policy developed in the 1990s by people like Paul Wolfowitz and his friends. It became known as the Wolfowitz policy. The guy who gave us the Iraq War, the criminal Iraq War, that Wolfowitz had a doctrine which said that our responsibility as the only superpower was to make sure that no country or any group of countries would be allowed to even obtain the strength to be able to challenge our global hegemony militarily in order to impose our hegemony economically. So this has been blown to pieces. Obama has been defeated already in Syria. He's frantic, but there's not much they can do. Not only has he failed in the strategic realm, but the entire policy since the crash of 2007 and 8 to, as what Obama called his policy to restrain Wall Street, in fact was not a policy to restrain Wall Street, but to make sure they were not restrained. The so-called Dodd-Frank bill in the U.S., which was a bill which made sure that there would be no restraints on the wild speculative binge that had been unleashed in the United States when the Glass-Steagall bill was taken down in the 1990s. The Glass-Steagall bill, for those of you who may not know briefly, was Roosevelt's bedrock policy of forcing a division between investment banks who were allowed to speculate but had no government support under Glass-Steagall, and commercial banks who were not allowed to speculate had to use deposits to invest in the real economy for the general welfare. It would effectively be an invasion on the side of al-Qaeda, and the result would be the setup of a caliphate across both Syria and Iraq by the most radical, bloody, bestial forces amongst these Saudi-funded terrorist apparatus. And he was forced to turn back at that time, but as we know, he continued in a covert way through Turkey and through the Saudi apparatus to pursue this criminal, illegal war against the legitimate Assad government in Syria. So what did Putin do? Putin took a flank against Obama, not head-on in Ukraine, but he went into Syria to do what Obama claimed he was doing, which was to fight terrorism. He moved in with his Air Force, he reconstituted the legitimate government of Syria, the elected government of the Assad regime, the legitimate government. In other words, what they were doing by going in was legitimate under international law because he'd been invited by the legitimate government, unlike the U.S. bombing, which is totally illegitimate, against the desire of the Syrian government, let alone, as I said before, without having gone for approval from even our own Congress. So he's now about to win. This is a situation which the Obama criminal war, his effort now to use surrogates like the Saudis and the Turks, bluffing that they're going to intervene because they're terrified, frantic, that the Russians and the reconstituted Syrian army is about to defeat terrorism in Syria, which will obviously have tremendous implications for actually cleaning out the terrorist nests in the rest of the Middle East. And they have to stop it. That their ability to deal with the current global breakdown of the Western financial, not global, the Western financial system breakdown depends upon their capacity to do two things. One, to be able to continue dictate, to develop their country, to restrain the terrorist impulses among some of the Saudi-funded Sunni networks, and repulse them not only militarily, but by developing the country in a way which was unprecedented in the rest of the Arab world. So the reality of Obama's collaboration with the British Saudi-funded terrorist networks around al-Qaeda, which was most evident in Libya, where we launched an invasion outside of international law, outside of even our own constitutional law, by not even attempting to get our congressional support, which is required by our Constitution. But then moved on to Syria, where Putin recognized that this could no longer be hidden, that Obama was actually siding with the terrorists that we supposedly were opposing in order to overthrow Assad, as he did in Libya against Gaddafi, leaving Libya as a hellhole of warring terrorist factions, which was the intent. And the same result would come about in Syria if this were continued. And for those of you who haven't already heard this, I think it's extremely important to know that leading figures within the U.S. military and military intelligence have quite publicly identified the fact that Obama is, in a crazy fashion, allying himself with terrorists in order to achieve the regime change goal. General Michael Flynn, who was head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the intelligence agency for our military, in the 2012 to 14, I believe it was, until he was fired by Obama, publicly identified the fact that when Obama tried to invade Syria in 2013 over the chemical weapons, I'm sure you remember that he personally warned General Dempsey, the head of our Joint Chiefs, who then warned the president that this invasion I titled my presentation, The Principle of the Flank, and the emergence of a new world order from the corpse of the British Empire. I hope to be able to convey that in a short time and have time for questions. I think we have to start with a recognition that Obama has been thoroughly defeated by one of the most brilliant strategic thinkers of our time, which is Vladimir Putin. And the way he defeated him was through a sophisticated flank against Obama's weakness in the form of his functioning as an asset of the British Empire. The British Empire referring to the financial institutions of London and Wall Street, which have always been the core of the British Empire's imperial policies as well as their economic policies. If you look at what happened in Europe, we have, of course, the collapse of the European banking system, which is now, they can no longer keep off the front pages of the newspapers because of the total breakdown of their stock values, the recognition that they're all completely flooded with worthless speculative debts, which can no longer be bailed out, they can no longer be bailed in, they can no longer pump money in. It's reached a denouement, and it's about to blow apart. But in that context, the Obama administration launched this coup against Ukraine several years ago, openly supporting neo-Nazi organizations, carrying the swastika, openly working hand in hand, or actually praising the work of Stefan Bandera, who was Hitler's cohort in Ukraine in World War II. And this U.S.-sponsored